another episode of Gladio for Year. I am Russian Sam, not joined this time by Liam, but rest assured, we have a great episode lined up for you guys. We have a good friend of the pod here with us, King Krebs, who's a longtime listener, first-time caller, and he's going to be bringing some of his expertise to us to talk about a really horrendous topic, that being the Guatemalan syphilis experiments. How's it going, Krebs?
It's going well. I'm, yeah, it's a somber topic today, so yeah, I'm just preparing myself.
Yeah, it's going to be a very difficult topic. So let me just introduce what we're going to be talking about. Uh, this is the Guatemalan syphilis experiments, probably one of the worst examples of medical abuse done by the United States that I've come across so far. And really, that's quite an accomplishment because the history of medicine in the 20th century is full of enormous crimes. Most of us are at least tangentially familiar with some of them. For example, the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which was originally a New Deal project started to study syphilis in 399 rural African American men in Alabama. Back in those days, in that place, syphilis was grouped together with other conditions like anemia under the moniker of bad blood. So, when the Tuskegee study began in 1932, treatments for syphilis were still really primitive, and participants were nevertheless left uninformed of their true diagnosis or even that they were infectious. The neglect really only escalated after the successful mass production of penicillin after the United States entry into World War II. Despite the fact that there was now a reliable cure, the subjects of the Tuskegee experiment continued to go untreated. In fact, the researchers behind Tuskegee went to great lengths to keep the subjects in the dark about their diagnosis. When conscription began and many of these men were drafted into the armed forces and underwent the prerequisite medical observations, the team went out of their way to conceal the diagnosis from the participants. An experiment to study the pre-antibiotic treatments for syphilis was thus transformed into an observational study, which withheld treatment from patients with the aim of seeing how the disease would progress. The study would continue until 1972, when a whistleblower finally revealed to the world what was going on. And by the end of all that, of the 399 men who had participated, 28 had died of syphilis, 100 died of related complications, 40 wives were infected, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. But Tuskegee was neither the first nor the last syphilis experiment to be undertaken at the time. Some of the experiments conducted contemporaneously had in fact been done abroad on a far greater scale, with the mass infection of patients with venereal diseases who had no idea what was being done to them. In fact, some of the figures involved in Tuskegee would continue their work in these foreign contexts, and this work would leave a very dark mark on the medical profession, which continues to linger to this day. At a time when the medical experiments of the Nazis and the imperial Japanese were coming to the fore, unscrupulous Americans would be conducting experiments which would not look out of place in either of these contexts. Unfortunately, the list of such misconduct is very long. Within the United States itself, domestic populations were deliberately exposed under the framework of MK Ultra to all kinds of awful experiments. Unknowing military personnel were deliberately exposed to high doses of radiation as well, just to name a few examples. Meanwhile, in France, around the same time, inhabitants of the small village of Pont Saint-Esprit were poisoned with ergotism on a mass scale under the rubric of MK Naomi. Many people would be hospitalized, and 7 people would ultimately die because of what was done to them. Meanwhile, in Puerto Rico, the local populations were subjected to horrific abuses and mass sterilization by many different actors, among them Cornelius Rhodes, who would later become the director of Sloan Kettering. Rhodes held Puerto Ricans to be subhuman and injected them with live cancer cells, among other things. I could go on and on, really, but today we'll be focusing on just one example. As I mentioned at top, we are going to be exploring the history of the Guatemalan syphilis experiments. And to help guide us all through this, because I don't really have much medical knowledge, we have, as I mentioned, our good friend, King Krebs, who is a grad student currently working on these kinds of questions. You guys can probably hear from my tone of voice that this is going to be a really heavy one. So normal exclaimers here, trigger warning for everything, really. If you are listening to this with children, I would probably advise you to consider if this is age appropriate for them. And all those caveats being said, let's talk about how this is going to work. The main source for this episode is a report commissioned by the Obama administration titled Ethically Impossible, STD Research in Guatemala from 1946 to 1948, which was issued by the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. We'll return to the report itself in a bit, but let me give you guys a basic summary of what happened. Although what happened in Guatemala is generally referred to as the syphilis experiment, other STDs were involved as well, namely gonorrhea and chancroid. The experiments began in Guatemala in July 1946, and the main portion, under the direction of Dr. Cutler, would conclude in December 1948, although lower profile work would continue until 1951, and samples would continue to be processed as late as 1953. The main phase of the experiment was run primarily by Dr. John Cutler, and it was in this period when the greatest abuses would happen. In brief, according to the aforementioned report, the Guatemalan experiments involved 5,128 subjects, counting those who had pre-existing STD conditions, as well as those infected for the experiments. Of these subjects, only 820 of them received some form of treatment, and most of these were the relatively ineffective arsenic and bismuth-derived ointments. Most of the subjects were not aware of what was being done to them, and vulnerable populations were used, primarily prisoners, mental health patients, orphans, prostitutes, and soldiers within the Guatemalan military. So before we get into this, let's just set some context. So STDs, what can you tell us about them, Krebs?
Well, their STDs are sexually transmitted diseases, and they go back from a long time. We have old DNA evidence going back 4,500 years from skeletal remains from the bell beaker culture discovered in modern day Germany. Um, and it's believed that diseases like herpes may have existed in humans and even Neanderthals for a million years.
Mm-hmm. So where does syphilis come from exactly? I know that this has been a topic of debate for well over a century, because some people think that it was a New World disease, one of the few that would have been introduced into the Old World from the Americas by Columbus, and this is primarily based on the fact that it first appears in the literature around 1495 under the moniker of French disease, because it was brought into the Italian peninsula by French troops who were intervening in the Italian wars. So that would seem to suggest that this was a New World disease, but others think that it pre-existed, that there were already wells of the disease in Eurasia. One recent DNA study I came across seems to confirm that the disease was found in Eastern Europe, places like Finland and Poland, which would predate 1495, but the question still isn't totally resolved because, from what I could tell, the margin of error for the dating was large enough that these skeletons might post-date the proposed introduction from the New World. And the advent of syphilis, it was really massive. It had a huge effect on European sexual patterns, because when we think of the Middle Ages and early modernity, we tend to imagine that that Europeans were all really prudish and that they feared God too much to have sex for pleasure, which is very much not the case, actually. Premarital sex would have been pretty normal, but with the introduction of syphilis, just like the advent of the Black Plague some 150 years before, people became much more cautious. And there really was a great reason to be very cautious. Could you maybe give us some idea of what syphilis infection looks like?
Yeah, for sure. So, The symptoms, eventually, they can lead to pretty damaging neurological conditions. It can lead to like dementia-like symptoms over time, and there's like a latent phase too. So you're not immediately going to be aware of the infection. So it really is like a silent killer in many ways. So it's definitely like for someone back then it definitely would feel like you're fated to meet a very bad end.
Right. And there wasn't really a way to cure it, was it?
Um, well, I guess they were using arsenic and bismuth derived compounds for a while. So, but no, there wasn't like a real cure that was available for them. It was kind of yeah, it was kind of a bad fate that they just had to face.
Yeah, and in fact, the arsenic and bismuth stuff was really the less bad option. For a long time, it seems like mercury was the default treatment, which, if anyone knows, if you guys know anything about the side effects of mercury toxicity, it's uh, it's it's not great, and the treatment itself was also very unpleasant. One description I found from the chapter by Beck in a book called Plague, Pox, and Pestilence, Disease and History describes it as follows, quote, a patient undergoing the treatment was secluded in a hot, stuffy room and rubbed vigorously with a mercury ointment several times a day. The massaging was done near a hot fire, which the sufferer was then left next to in order to sweat. The process went on for a week to a month or more, and would later be repeated if the disease persisted. Other toxic substances, such as vitriol and arsenic, were also employed, but their curative effects were equally in doubt. As one early modern English saying went, one night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury, which just goes to show that this was something that weighed on the minds of people back in those days because everyone knew that these mercury treatments were really, really an awful affair. When did mercury stop being the default mode of treatment, would you say?
I think around 1909, or like around then, you see different treatments coming up based on arsenic. So yay, you're going from mercury to arsenic improvement,
Yay, improvement.
Yeah.
I
Um,
fucking love science.
and apparently was originally synthesized by Paul Ehrlich. Sounds like the population bomb guy. uh, but only it was
Mm.
initially, recognized as, working against syphilis. And its application was definitely not ideal in any way.
Wait, so when you say it, what are you talking about exactly?
Well, the arsenic solution, it's what's called salvarsan. It was like the Tylenol of the time, but for STDs.
Ah,
But it was done by mixing with distilled water and injected into the patient, and it came with its own, terrible side effects. So you'd have to lie face down. The salvarsan was melted with a small amount of methyl alcohol mixed with some water, some caustic soda, and this acidic injection was then given to the buttocks, and it was extremely painful. But yeah, I mean, it was better than the previous era of mercury.
yeah. When I was reading about this stuff, I read that sometimes the people given these Salvarsan injections would also have to be given heavy narcotics because they would be in pain for the entire course of the treatment, basically really awful stinging pain. But compared to mercury, it really was a godsend. It was much less toxic naturally, although people did still die from this stuff for the record. But it was really difficult to use and administer. So because of that, other less effective but also less inconvenient forms of treatment were being discovered, or I should say discovered in air quotes, because there was no real evidence of efficacy for most of these compounds from what I understand. There was really an impetus to start looking into the stuff with the entry of the U.S. into World War One, because As soon as they got off the boat, American GIs were falling sick left and right from gonorrhea and syphilis, what they called venereal diseases back in those days. And of course, they were getting all this from their contact with prostitutes and not being familiar with the basic sex safety protocol as well. So, because of that, military planners began to grow really concerned about what this would mean for future wars, which America would participate in. Uh, to use modern parlance, this was a national security threat. So, what was the military doing to try to keep STDs under control at this time?
Well, they had a thing called a pro kit, and it was a pretty invasive procedure to inoculate the soldiers, and they would have to like first urinate and then wash with soap and water, and then directly inject a silver protonate solution into the penis to prevent gonorrhea, and then rub a calomel ointment over their penis and pubic region to prevent syphilis. And the,
Oh my.
so calomel is also like a mercury-based solution. So you still have we're still getting the mercury in. So it is extremely terrible. If you want to have a prophylactic procedure, you want it to be as like easy to use and readily available as possible, and this is like the exact opposite. And arsenic therapy also required 18 months of consistent treatment. So you can't randomly like stop using the treatment and then continue later on. It won't be as effective. So it's all pretty pretty terrible options at the time.
Right, right. But the question really got much more resonance with America's entry into World War II. The NRC subcommittee on venereal diseases head wrote that he expected, quote, approximately 350,000 fresh infections with gonorrhea, which will account for 7 million lost man days per year, the equivalent of putting out of action for a full year the entire strength of 2 full armored divisions, or of 10 aircraft carriers. And so, to this end, new experiments were being arranged. The direct precursor to the Guatemalan experiments, which we'll talk about later, in fact, were the Terre Haute prison experiments. What can you tell us about those?
As terrible as this experiment was, I would say it's definitely tamer compared to even Tuskegee and the Guatemala series of experiments. First of all, this one actually kind of had a foundational idea of what it was intending to pursue, and they at least had some level of liability. Like they actually had the prisoners, agree to participate voluntarily, even if that is like it is to be. It is pretty difficult to say that prisoners weren't coerced, especially in a federal prison at in the 40s. But compared to the other settings, it seems like there was more individual autonomy, hopefully. And the participants were got $100 at the conclusion of the experiment, and they got a certificate of merit and commendatory letter when they were up for parole, but the prisoners weren't told this beforehand. Um, and they were informed of what was going to be done to them and the risks and like what treatment they were provided. There were two different treatments. There was a pre-oral antibiotic and a post-infection urethral topical solution. So they were told like what they were getting themselves into. And the unique thing about this experiment is that a lot of the bureaucrats were pretty, I would say they're pretty scared about how the experiment would be taken by the larger public, which is pretty unique for this era, I would say. There was a lot of discussion about whether they should do this or not, whether they should pursue this. So, do you want to go more into the history of how this was organized?
Right, of course. But first, I just want to consider the ethics here, just because, like, when I was reading about this, maybe this is the result of knowing, uh, in retrospect, what would be done in Guatemala by the same people who organized the Terre Haute experiments. But um, it just seems like, unfortunately, we do need some level of human experimentation because we're not petri dishes, we're not rabbits or mice or whatever kind of creatures get used in these studies. Ultimately, you do need to have tests on human subjects to make sure that this stuff actually works and to know like what the proper treatment protocols are. Um, so the fact that these people were first of all not coerced into this in any way, that they weren't made aware of the fact that there's an incentive for them to participate, because if they do, they'll get a nice letter sent to the parole board uh, to hopefully shorten their sentence and things of that nature. But nevertheless, I do get the sense that just operating with prisoners is problematic in and of itself. But I'd like to hear what you think.
I definitely don't think this is anywhere close to an ethical experiment personally. I just don't see how prisoners can actually consent in most cases really, especially for something as like potentially invasive as this procedure. I just don't see them having a real like substantial way of kind of combating the power imbalance, especially like in a prison environment, where they are subject to like pretty totalitarian control over, their daily existence. So it becomes difficult to what extent can they even consent to a lot of stuff. And given the later history of prison
Right.
experiments in the U.S. that goes on for decades after this, and prison treatment today, and I just can't really support it in any manner. But even in 2011, there's a New York Times article about how this experiment was very ethical.
Right.
New York Times,
Right. Yeah.
amazing piece.
Yeah. We'll get to that one by the end of the episode, maybe. Yes. You were telling me that the stuff that went into this experiment would later be used to create the Holmesburg experiments, which that prison facility was apparently known as the Terror Dome, which really tells you something about what was being done over there. Let's talk about this experiment itself. Like, who was in charge? What were the parameters of what they were actually studying?
There was pretty clear intention behind the study. It is to try to, I guess, artificially infect a patient or transfer gonorrhea in a kind of a clinical setting, like topically. And it was kind of started off by Dr. Carpenter at University of Rochester. And he works with Dr. Moore of
Mm-hmm.
the National Research Council. And there's this like huge bureaucratic huddle where they discuss like possible sites. The National Research Council Subcommittee on Venereal Diseases and the New York City Department of Health discuss their ideas. And the NRC agrees eventually that they should try to go through like a federal program, so that they have like sound legal backing. So they like go through the Army, the Public Health Service, the Committee on Medical Research, the OSRD, and they get approval and buy-in from like all
Mm-hmm.
these top, organizations like the Public Health Service, National Research Council, the Surgeon General, um, and ultimately they do end up, providing the waivers and the like recruiting voluntarily. And they also do provide two treatments, which included sulfonamide as well as like topical agents. At this point, sulfonamides were, I guess, like more common or still somewhat more common for for treating gonorrhea. But later on, eventually, penicillin quickly becomes the standard for gonorrhea treatment too. But yeah, sulfonamides are still used today. They just have some side effects relating to folic acid processing. So it's like you can still use it. Just have to be careful, with the doses and the interactions. But um, yeah, I mean, at least it's a real medicine, and not they're not getting some random metal mercury treatment or something.
Yeah, and who are the personalities involved?
Well, yeah, you have the like president of the AMA, the chairman of the NRC, um, Dr. Arthur Bloomfield, and initially they were all against it, and it even goes up to Vannevar Bush, who you'll see a lot in I guess like New Deal era, big science, when the federal government is heavily investing in science and like Manhattan Project and all that like New Deal era federal military industrial science research funding type stuff. And I would say he's the godfather of like big science in America, in a way, like the big grant systems that were set up. And he was
Right.
initially kind of against it. And he, as far as I looked this up before. He's not related to the Bush family. He's just another guy named Bush.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and because all these people were hesitant, they were like considering like let's just use like military or federal prisoners because it's like a less sympathetic population. And there was a previous experiment locally in Oklahoma where they were testing prophylaxis on sex workers, and it was reported in a local newspaper, and no one really was outraged by it. So there was like, okay, like what if we experiment on prisoners? No one's gonna care. Is basically the kind of attitude. Um, and there is like into the 90s, there is a tradition of American institutions, psychiatric or institutions for problematic children and adults, like just
Mm-hmm.
not being the greatest places. I mean, they still aren't, but they're this is definitely like in an era, and it's part of that kind of strain of attitude towards institutions kind of being, I guess, thought of as disposable, or just not as respected. The people there are not as respected, as I guess, more upstanding, upper class citizens were.
Right, of course. So let's talk about the Terre Haute experiments themselves. There were ultimately 241 participants, and uh, but the experiments ultimately, from what I understand, had to be cut short because they weren't able to consistently cause infection in the test subjects. And this caused the study to be shuttered in July 1944 after only 10 months, I believe.
Yeah, so they were like trying to apply, I guess, like pus and colonies harvested from other strains, and directly implanted on the penises of different of prisoners participants, but it kind of ended up never working, and they just weren't able to create like a human model of transmission in a controlled setting, like that. Um, and interestingly, at least some of the strains were from locally arrested sex workers. So you don't like then there's no mention if they were like okay they consented to this or if they if they got paid or if like they were asked um, permission. Like none of that is available. So um, yeah, it kind of ended in failure. But at least it showed that gonorrhea isn't just it's not as easy to spread gonorrhea as they thought it was.
Right. Okay. Yeah, so let's step back a little bit and talk about penicillin because because before the Terre Haute experiments were even beginning, penicillin was starting to hit the production lines. Uh, what's penicillin exactly, and why was it so important?
Well, penicillin is a compound that comes from a fungus and it was discovered by accident.
Mm-hmm.
And it basically destroys the cell walls of bacteria. It falls under a beta lactam grouping of antibiotics. Um, yeah, and it has a broad spectrum coverage of a lot of different bacteria. But again, like recently, we have more specific antibiotics that we use for different diseases like gonorrhea. Like most commonly for gram negative, you would use like ceftriaxone or something like that. But not now. But at the time, like penicillin is still like kind of like a miracle drug.
Right, yeah, we kind of screwed the pooch by using penicillin too much, so a bunch of infections ended up becoming resistant to it. But yes, from what I understand, its the name is derived from a type of fungus called penicillium, and again, this was discovered entirely accidentally. Uh, Dr. Fleming, he was working on some other experiments with substances which would kill bacteria. And as I heard the story, he didn't close a window one day, and so he went out for the night, and he had some petri dishes lying on the counter. And when he returned the following morning, he noticed that in some of the petri dishes, like there were blotches where there were no bacteria growing at all. That there was something that was being brought in by the wind into the office, into these petri dishes, which totally by accident would change the history of medicine.
Yeah, talk about an eureka moment. Like just like most drugs, I would say. Like you take something that you find naturally, or something that happens, and then you find something that works, and then you like kind of refine it and extract it and study it. And yeah, penicillin is one such story.
Right, yes. So the uses of penicillin were being explored for over a decade because, again, this discovery happened in 1928. But it took a very long time for it to become a realistic treatment because it still had to be synthesized in very small batches. Uh, from what I understand, some of these early experiments were very difficult as well because some subjects would die because the researchers ran out of penicillin to give them, and infection was not killed off entirely, which would mean that the disease would have a resurgence and the patient would be unable to actually fight it off. Um, but there was one case in 1942 when meningitis was cured entirely after only a couple of days of treatment. And the researchers, who were British, by the way, Alexander Fleming was working in Oxford, I believe it was. They approached the USDA to talk about creating facilities for its mass production, and America really was the place to go to talk about any kinds of mass industrial production, just because American capacity was just so enormous that they were able to pump out this stuff. Once they had the facilities set up, they were able to just pump out massive quantities of this stuff. Yeah, so it enters production in 1942, but in the early days, availability was still very limited. In fact, it was so valuable that the urine of patients would often be collected so that the penicillin could be extracted and reused multiple times.
That's crazy. I didn't know about that. That's wild.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, um, by this point, word about this wonder drug was starting to get out, and in June 1943, Dr. Mahoney, who would be instrumental in the Guatemalan experiments and who was also one of the organizers of the Terre Haute experiments, was beginning to contemplate penicillin experiments to treat syphilis. And shortly thereafter, they were able to get a 4-person study to actually test the effectiveness of penicillin on the treatment of syphilis. And they found that it had cured the infection in all of the subjects within 8 days. Granted, this was a very small study, but it did lay the groundwork for showing that penicillin was indeed effective on against venereal diseases as well.
Yeah, and this is like a huge change from like getting a arsenic mercury 18-month program. So it's quite literally like a leap in progress.
Yeah, no, this is just like taking pills for a couple of days, and that's it. Like, was early procedure more complicated? Did they need to do infection? Did they need to do injections or something, or was it all the oral route back in those days?
So as far as I know, a lot of the early prophylaxis was like, getting injected with like a silver protonate, or an arsenic solution. So it's actually like more invasive. It wasn't just like, oh, I'm taking like an oral pill and it's like
Right.
gone.
Okay. Yeah. So penicillin, it works much more quickly. It's very effective, and it's not inconvenient to the same extent that the calomel stuff and all of those other substances were. But nevertheless, there was a problem that this stuff was still very expensive. Granted, they were very rapidly expanding productive capacity. By 1944, in the lead up to the invasion of Normandy, the US had stockpiled 2.3 million doses of penicillin already, and it very quickly became available for civilian use in March 1945. And then by June of that same year, American facilities were producing 646 billion units per year, which is just a massive exponential rise in production. But nevertheless, it's not as impressive as it sounds at first glance because a dose was something like a million units, I believe it was. So penicillin was still very expensive, and while it still couldn't be produced at the rate that would allow for its price to be very cheap, there were efforts undertaken to find lower cost treatments to the illness, and this introduced some really nasty incentives which would wreak havoc on the people subjected to the Guatemalan experiments. So let's finally move on to Guatemala. Uh, why Guatemala?
Um, that's I would say that's an interesting question. It was, it is in the, Monroe Doctrine sphere of influence country. I think that seems to have played a great role. And I would say like
Right.
only 8 years after this study begins, you'll have the infamous coup of Jacob Benz.
Mm-hmm.
Um, at this point, Guatemala is ruled by like a Juan Jose Arevalo, who is kind of like a nationalist. I would say like centrist with some developmentalistic characteristics. Like he formed like the Caribbean League. He had some vaguely pro-labor, pro-national politics that, but also like you know, heavily prosecuted labor unions and would at the same time try to play both the U.S. and the USSR off of each other
Right.
somewhat. Um, but in many ways, like Guatemala was still dominated, by a lot of American commercial and military interest at this point. So
From what I understand, Guatemala seemed like a great location because, aside from the political factors and the friendliness of the government to American interests, there would have been far less ethical scrutiny just because, first of all, these weren't American citizens, which American citizenship didn't really stop awful things from happening to within the country itself, of course, but nevertheless, there was just something more viscerally shocking to the idea of medical experimentation being done on Americans rather than these Guatemalans. And in fact, that brings us to the next point. Racism was a very strong factor in deciding that Guatemalans would be a good subject just because, uh, well, I mean, they constantly referred to the vast majority of the Guatemalan population as Indians. And these people were treated as basically idiots. In fact, in the uh, in the report that we read for this episode, there's a really entertaining comment made by Cutler, I believe it was, who's complaining that basically some of the subjects aren't compliant with getting their blood drawn because they're superstitious and they think that they're not getting enough food to make more blood, which really blew me out of the water. Like,
yeah, it's so crazy thing to say, man. These guys are starving in prison, and you're like just out there just saying that. Like,
yeah, man. I mean, those silly Indian superstitions. Am I right?
yeah, there's a lot of that here.
Yeah.
There's also a degree of closeness between the academia and the medical, um, the academia and a lot of the I would say the researchers in Guatemala with the U.S. at the time, like particularly the venereal research disease laboratory worked with a Dr. Juan Funes, and Dr. Funes was like, "Yo, I have a clinic in Guatemala. You guys, we can do some studies there if you want." And there was also like a lot.
No, he didn't have a clinic. Sorry, he was just like a doctor who was there on like a fellowship, and he was like, "Hey, maybe you guys should check out Guatemala."
Yeah, yeah, sorry, yeah, he was, yeah, yeah, he eventually ran a clinic in Guatemala, but yeah, he was for, yeah, but there was a lot of established connections there, and I can't help but think that the imperialism becoming more open in the 40s. I think that definitely could have played a role with the army planners envisioning a more aggressive, involved military role, especially in Latin America. And so like
Right.
understanding, but so having a study kind of anticipating how to maintain like army morale and health during a devastating invasion, and also kind of expecting a lot of war crimes to be continuously happening during occupation, and how to navigate that without without mass infections is something that's definitely on the back of the mind. It kind of reminds me of how like a lot of the yellow fever research came because of the U.S. involvement in Cuba, the Spanish American War. So it
Right.
definitely has like that kind of imperialistic, like almost settler mentality, mindset of like, okay, we need to find a way to continue doing war crimes and also not getting diseases. As terrible as that sounds.
Right, and of course, this was also a major impetus for the treatment of malaria because that would actually allow Europeans to get a foothold in the interior of Africa to a much greater extent.
Yeah, I mean, not just Africa, but also like Southeast Asia and South Asia, hinterland
Ah,
as
right,
well,
yes.
because like you can exploit all that like marshy terrain that was previously kind of less directly governable and less extractable. Yeah, tier subjects. So
Right, yeah. So just goes to show the ruling ideology is going to have a very strong influence on the science of the time. So that's generally a good thing to keep in mind. But anyway, getting back to Guatemala, uh, what exactly was the question that the researchers were looking to study?
well, that's where that's the most I guess evil part of this is that they were supposed to study the effectiveness of different prophylactic treatments in controlling both syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroids, but mostly syphilis, including the older orismifloxacin versus penicillin. But
Mm-hmm.
again, like that doesn't. We already know that by 1946, they already won an award, the Lasker Prize, for having found that penicillin basically cures syphilis. So it is a very flimsy justification, and another justification for the study is trying to perfect infection, or like a model of transmission of gonorrhea and syphilis person to person invasively, but at the same time it's like, I mean, if you have the cure to those conditions, then why do you need to continue to make like use human experimentation to model the transmission? It's like it's very it is not the for such a massive undertaking, it is, I would say, quite shoddy justification, and the actual science gets even more muddled, and the experiments just start to stop making sense and just start becoming horror stories, basically. Yeah.
Right. And despite the fact that this was very questionable, just from a basic methodological standpoint, leaving ethics aside, in February 1946, the syphilis study section received the proposal for these experiments, and many of the members, including the head, Dr. Joseph Moore, were affiliates with Johns Hopkins University, which is something to keep in mind. It's sort of a Chekhov's gun. We'll get back to it when it's important. But so because of this, they received their approval, and writing about why Guatemala in particular was such an attractive destination, Dr. Mahoney wrote in July 1947, quote, "It has been considered impractical to work out, under post-war conditions in the United States, the solution of certain phases concerned with the prevention and treatment of syphilis. These problems are largely concerned with the development of an effective prophylactic agent for both gonorrhea and syphilis, and the prolonged observation of patients treated with penicillin for early syphilis. Because of the relatively fixed character of the population and because of the highly cooperative attitude of the officials, both civil and military, an experimental laboratory in Guatemala City has been established." And this laboratory was established by Dr. John Cutler, who was the subordinate of Mahoney, and who was sent down to Guatemala to make the necessary arrangements with the proper authorities. Once again, these experiments were conducted with the full knowledge and permission of the Guatemalan government, uh, because there were many promises made to the government about the fact that, they're going to get top of the line medical facilities, they're going to gain expertise with how to combat these really awful diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea. So it seemed like a good deal to the people in the government, just even leaving aside any bad faith motions by American compradors, just making it easy for the Americans to do whatever they want. There would have been good reasons for Guatemalan officials to want these experiments to take place in their country.
Yeah, like from a just a naive standpoint, it's like, oh, like we're getting funding and resources and well respected academics in our country here, and cooperating with our local experts, and we're going to develop some prophylaxis. But yeah, that's the reality was very different. A lot of it was driven by like top level military contacts and very specific yeah, military and political contacts driving this, as opposed to like maybe like civilian representative organizations. There was no like People's Committee of Guatemalan syphilis patients who are like trying to reach out to the U.S.
Right.
government and you know negotiating like a common agreement. It wasn't like that. It was very much like select connections that were like channeled to make this happen.
And in fact, to this effect, from what I understand, Dr. Cut he set up the first set of experiments, which were meant to generate goodwill, and in fact, these were the ones that were comparatively above board. Uh, in this set of experiments, 309 soldiers received treatment, and of these, 242 were infected by the researchers themselves. Uh, but but again, these 309 subjects were all given treatment. Some of them were even given penicillin, which was once again problematic to administer from the perspective of the Americans because it was just so expensive. In fact, Cutler had written to Maloney asking to make penicillin more readily available for trials because this was a much more effective treatment than any of the other ones. But Mahoney, he was really dead set against this. He said, quote, "Entering into a too comprehensive program which may involve the use of more of the drug than we are able to procure." And so because of that, Cutler agreed to limit penicillin use, and very, very few people in Guatemala would receive that.
Yeah, there is definitely like a racial and yeah, just like a bigotry aspect to this, where like it's like, let's not, they basically don't view like a lot of the subjects as equal, you know, um, or respectable, and they're just trying to, and it's not even methodologically sound. Like, why are you not, using penicillin when it's the state of the line treatment? There's just like no reason not to. If you want to compare it to the older treatment, like why don't you do like a larger, like if you want to do a larger penicillin prophylaxis study, then why don't you actually give people penicillin and see what happens and record it in detail? But I don't know. It's just again, it's almost like an exercise in egotism and like an obsession with spreading plague, um, rather than actually like finding anything out or curing something or making something mean.
Of course. Uh, so let's get into the experiments right now and see what they actually consisted of. Again, many different groups would be subjected to these experiments, most of them without their knowledge or consent, really, for what was happening to them. They were, in fact, just under the impression that it was routine medical checkups, most of them. Um, but there was some really shocking stuff going on. Can you talk about the different cohorts of subjects?
Yeah, so there were like roughly seven groups exposed to three pathogenic diseases. So it was sex workers, soldiers, prisoners, orphans, leprosy patients, psychiatric patients, and as we mentioned before, a couple of U.S. servicemen as well, and some Guatemalan servicemen. So gonorrhea, again, it's like a urethral, like ocular and rectal infection, and it's caused by gram-negative bacteria. Chancroids are they're like skin abrasions, and they're caused again gram-negative Haemophilus infection, and syphilis is a Treponema pallidum is it's a spirochete type of bacteria, so it's like a spiral shaped. And yeah, so these are the three main STDs they were like testing on. And yeah, so they were doing like for gonorrhea, they were doing like urethral, ocular, and rectal administration. Chancroids, they were like using like skin and back abrasions, and syphilis, they were doing some very invasive procedures like orally ingesting syphilis, abrasive penile injection, as well as cisternal punctures, which is where they would literally like inject syphilis into the cerebrospinal fluid at the cisterna magna, like right underneath the cerebellum. And you do that through the back of the skull, and just drilling holes in through their heads, basically, injecting syphilis directly to the brain. Which is like, there's really no point in doing that, like because it's kind of like you know what's gonna happen. Like there's no scientific reason to do that really because you already know have hundreds of years of documentation of what neurosyphilis is. So yeah, it does just doesn't make sense like why anyone would want to do that or need to do that even. Like and it's questionable how sterile the environments were when they were doing this. So it just doesn't make sense.
Oh yeah, they were reusing needles regularly, from
Yeah,
what I've read.
so it's like it just doesn't make sense why they were doing because like even from a scientific standpoint, like if you want to look at if you want to see like if cisternal puncture for whatever reason is get will instantly cause like neurosyphilis, then you would need a sterile environment to make sure to rule out other contaminants. But if you're like reusing needles, you're like it's not methodologically sound at all, which is the least of the problems here. But there's like no excuse at any level of what's going on here, and it just goes completely off the rails very quickly.
Yeah, so as we mentioned previously, prisoners were one of the larger cohorts. There were it seems like for whatever reason there was a really high false positive rate because they noticed that there were a lot of people in Guatemala who were testing positive for syphilis, but who were nevertheless not really expressing symptoms. Why was that?
Um, I think there could have definitely been contamination. Also, they were using a less accurate serology test or antibody test. They were using cardiolipin over the Kahn and Mazzini tests, which were way more accurate at the time. So they're not even using like cutting edge like diagnostic tools. So it's just yeah, and then they just blame like, oh, these are like different people, so we're not used to like testing them because they're like, oh, they're more Indian, so it's like it's just so strange. Or they'll like do it. Or I remember like one of them would cite it to like environmental, like the Aristotelian, like oh, like the cold makes you hardy, or in the like the warmth makes you lazy. Like they were like chalk it up to like environmental or climatic differences that like different racial categories would experience, as opposed to like oh, like what if we use a more accurate test, or what if we don't contaminate our samples or something.
Yeah, and this was really the most shocking thing about all of this to me, just how much they were looking to cut corners to save costs when, in fact, these were really well funded projects that really had no need to even try to, you know, reuse needles and things of that nature. Like, Why? Why were they doing this?
I honestly, a lot of it does feel like grifting. Like it feels like Theranos. They're just eating all these big contracts and big grants and just cashing in the checks. And a lot of people get rewarded from it and experience career progression. So I think there's a lot of careerism and just extreme like disdain for other people and just extreme lack of ethics and compassion, or even like basic human standards. Um, and I think that's the biggest motivation that I can see here.
So were they just like literally pocketing the money that was going to them?
I'm not sure if they were doing that as much as they were just like writing off the fact that they were getting these government positions and getting the grants and getting to eventually cash in a pension. It, it really is like extremely banal 9 to 5 evil shit. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. Okay. So there were the prisoners, as I mentioned, but that's really just the tip of the icebergs. The most appalling cohort were psychiatric patients, which again, this was when the Terre Haute experiments were being conceived and they were looking for ideas for where such experiments could take place. Someone initially suggested mental asylums, but that was almost immediately scrapped just because it was clear to everyone that, first of all, these people cannot give consent categorically, and second of all, that they're just not fit to understand what was being done to them. But all such considerations went out the window the moment they crossed the border.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because you hear a lot about like the progressive era, I guess the 60s and 1860s, 1870s progressive era, like, or I guess earlier than that, with Dorothea Dix, like all the great reformers.
Right.
Like, oh, like we need compassionate schooling and like mental health systems, and you hear like the progressives of the 20s and stuff, and you just see this, and it's like completely when it comes to a different country, when it comes to a basically a colony in progress, it's just completely thrown out the window. And they're doing lumbar punctures on kids, on 49 out of the 500 kids they studied. Um, and of the 89 kids who got a positive serology reaction, only 55 actually got to see a doctor and get treatment. So it's like they're just literally going to orphanages and like doing spinal taps on kids. So it's like, why? Just there's just no reason to be doing that really. Um, like because yeah, I mean you can probably diagnose neurosyphilis without a spinal sample. At that point. I mean, if they're getting like neurosyphilis, it's like you don't need a you don't need a spinal tap. I mean, you can tell from a lot of the clinical data that you could get, um, but it's just it's really horrible. And the treatment of the psychiatric patients is definitely, I would say, and the sex workers is definitely some of the most like horrifying. They did hundreds of cisternal punctures and lumbar punctures on the 642 psychiatric patients, and a lot of the treatment for the psychiatric patients was not documented, but there were 250 syphilis positive patients all the way till 1953 of the psychiatric cohort. So they were like injecting people with syphilis left and right, and like just digging into their skulls and stuff. So it's just very very insane stuff.
Right. And speaking of psychiatric patients, one of the examples included in ethically impossible just dropped my jaw. I'm just going to quote this directly just because I I don't have it in me to try to reword this, but quote, Bertha was a female patient in the psychiatric hospital. Her age and the illness that brought her to the hospital are unknown. In February 1948, Bertha was injected into her left arm with syphilis. A month later, she developed scabies, an itchy skin condition caused by a mite. Several weeks later, lead investigator Dr. John Cutler noticed that she had also developed red bumps where they had injected her arm, lesions on her arms and legs, and her skin was beginning to waste away from her body. Bertha was not treated for syphilis until 3 months after her injection. Soon after, on August 23rd, Dr. Cutler wrote that Berta appeared as if she was going to die, but he did not specify why. That same day, he put gonorrheal pus from another male subject into both of Berta's eyes, as well as into her urethra and rectum. He also reinfected her with syphilis. Several days later, Berta's eyes were filled with pus from the gonorrhea, and she was bleeding from her urethra. On August 27th, Berta died. I'm just blunt. I'm just honestly speechless. I just don't understand how, like, one can engage in that level of sadism. Like, this is very clearly, like, of no medical use to anyone. How could anyone, like, do this to another person?
Yeah, it's pretty heartbreaking, and it's one of the many horror stories. We can't get into all of them that were involved here, but it's just so sad that a lot of people haven't recognized it, and it was like kind of it's relatively unknown for most people, um, and just how widespread and just how many people were involved. Mostly, most of the soldiers were luckier because a lot of them got treatment, but psychiatric patients, only 237 of them received treatment, and not all of it was even like good treatment. Um, and for the licensed sex workers at the time, Guatemala had a licensing systems for sex workers. Um, at least four were intentionally exposed, and whether they were paid or not is unsure. And four were naturally infected. So they were basically the doctors would watch as they would, get naturally infected by um, known carriers, and there's no record whether they were paid or not. Like once they were recruited for the study. And basically, the Guatemalan law required that prostitutes, licensed prostitutes, be of age, and at least one of the participants was underage. Um, and Dr. Cutler was like taking extremely detailed notes on, very specific, like observations he was making as he was like watching these studies. And it's recorded that at least one worker had contact with 8 soldiers in 71 minutes, only 5%
Oh
transmission
my god.
in normal exposure. Um, and notes don't even show compensation to all the workers, and artificial inoculation with prophylaxis um, w- was later eventually perfected with successful infection rates all the way up to 94%. Um, but yeah, it was it's very voyeuristic, and like you can't even like this is like beyond like a like a horror story. Like you can't make this up. It's like stranger than fiction, really. Just how terrible this is. Because there are plenty of people who are infected with gonorrhea. You can find and like treat and see which treatments work better, or yeah, and there's already been like multiple studies at this point, like on how gonorrhea spreads. You don't need to expose like underage people to traffic underage people for this purpose. It's pretty insane. And it's kind of insane that he got in zero trouble despite involving an underage sex worker trafficked into this experiment. So pretty insane stuff.
Right. It just seems to me that the only thing of any kind of medical value that anyone got out of this was figuring out how to actually consistently infect people with gonorrhea, which again was what they weren't able to figure out in Terre Haute. But for some reason here they were just obsessed with this idea. The report "Ethically Impossible" it talks in great length about all of the different methods that they were trying to actually get people infected, and I don't know. I haven't really had time to look at this from the perspective of biological warfare or something like that, for example. But it does seem to me like an unstated thing throughout the report, which again, I have issues with the report that we'll get back to towards the end of the episode. It does seem like it just doesn't consider that maybe this had like an element of biological warfare planning into it. put into it.
Yeah, I mean, like it's literally most of the, I guess, if you can even call them methodological approaches, like all of them are literally related to making spread as efficient and as controlled as possible. So it's like, I mean, you can make up your own mind about that. It's just kind of insane. Because like the rest of the world and most people would be concerned about like, okay, like how do we prevent new transmission, which you can try different prophylactic approaches in high risk populations and see which ones work. You don't have to like actually like see, cause transmission in isolation and observe it and do it with that much detail. You can just like focus on prevention, and treatment.
Right.
But it's a very it is a I mean it is a military driven experiment. It is driven by an imperial war machine, so of course you're going to see that reflected in the characteristics and the ideology and the methodology of the research. So it's just like that. Like science alone is not like unideological. It is a product of ideology
Right.
of whoever is funding, supporting, and making it happen. So
Yeah. So um, these experiments would continue for many years. As I mentioned previously, uh, the official end to these experiments happened in December 1948 when they ran out of funding. But they did keep some people on the ground who continued to do some of this work and to collect samples for a while. Did Why was the experiment discontinued? First of all,
um, I really don't know. I feel like there probably had to have been some type of backlash internally, and it really wasn't producing any like new information. I feel that was like valuable. I think those were two key factors. I know that other people within the study were like pretty apprehensive toward Cutler, even if they were still doing evil, terrible shit. Like Cutler was something like a freak to them eventually. So yeah, which is really saying something. And a lot of the like we didn't get into this year, but like a lot of the details on how they
yeah,
perfected like syphilis transmission and gonorrhea transmission, it was like extremely invasive, like intraurethral injections, of gonorrhea into someone's like yeah, like using like a very sharp tools and stuff. So they were like up to some very very sick
yeah,
stuff.
and again, most of the people involved didn't even know what was being done to them.
Yeah, like for gonorrhea, they would call it deep inoculation, where like they would like basically, it is what it sounds like. They would go into the urethra with like a tool to make sure and that the infection happened. It was extremely painful with scarification was what they called the procedure of choice. That was like basically approached like a 90% inoculation rate. So that just goes to show how terrible, this is the procedures were. You can read up on the details on your own, but yeah, and for the syphilis exposure, like 688 patients, of them only 388 were treated. And they were doing like cross species syphilis studies too, kind of. They were doing rabbit derived syphilis and human derived wounds strains and like comparing them. 446 psychiatric patients were involved in the intentional syphilis exposure experiments, of whom only 294 got some treatment. Um, there is there is like mention that there was some intentional exposure of homosexual men to study the spread, but later documents say that didn't happen, despite there is some evidence in other documents that contradicts that, saying that it did happen. So it was literally doing like I mean this is the era of the coming out of the all the big war crimes hearings. This is the era after Nuremberg. So these guys are just really really insane for just
Yeah, this is
disregarding
some
everything.
Mengele shit, frankly.
Yeah, this is like not like even by the standards of the time, there's a lot of progressive stuff going around the world. I know like the Soviet Union banned lobotomies, like a lot of like socialist projects were like taking off with like universal healthcare approaches and
Right.
stuff, and you just have these guys just like, okay, what if I can spread gonorrhea basically stabbing someone um, in a very sensitive area. It's like just insane logic.
Um, I think I like I'm done for today. I don't have it in me to continue to talk about the to talk about the medical aspects of this. It's just too much for me. Let's move forward to the official acknowledgement by the U.S. government of what happened and the issuing of this report. Once again, a very large part of the information in this episode is derived from a report called Ethically Impossible, STD Research in Guatemala from 1946 to 1948, which was issued in September 2011. And I have a lot of issues with this report, but let's talk about how it came about.
Yeah, so around the Obama administration, there is I guess some awareness that this happened, and they assemble some couple of secretaries and cabinet members to like document what happened, and it is kind of like an exculpatory. What is I would say it's like disclosure as an exculpatory act in a way, like, oh, like acknowledgement itself as exculpatory, but it's like, no, that just means you acknowledged it. Like it doesn't mean you're materially changing any of the details.
Right,
It's just so, yeah, it just falls short of the horrors that frankly happened.
right.
So you have the Secretary of State, Obama, and Secretary of Health and Human Services formally apologized to Guatemala. The Guatemalan president at the time, Alvaro Colom, condemns it as a crime against humanity. The NIH director, calls it a dark chapter in the history of medicine. Um, and the thing is, despite you acknowledge it, it was not even like the last big mass human experimentation performed. The imperial war machine, the research aspect of it, just goes domestic, and you
Yeah,
have prison populations in Holmesburg and Philadelphia for decades. Under Dr. Kligman of UPenn, they get many experiments performed on them, and there's a great book about well, no, it's not great. It's a good, well researched book, but it's very dark, and it's called Acres of Skin, and it is directly from his quote on what he felt when he first saw the prisoners that he was going to experiment on for the first time. All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. And until 2021, the Department of Dermatology at UPenn was named after Dr. Kligman.
wow. Yeah. Um, yeah. So, as you mentioned, like a huge issue with the report is that it's basically meant to be exculpatory. There's a very large emphasis placed on Cutler himself, which granted, he was clearly a sadist who had no regard for human life. But nevertheless, it feels like he is just a very convenient scapegoat to try to pin all of this on just because uh, I mean, first of all, he would later also be involved with the Tuskegee experiments. Once again, this was after the invention of penicillin and after these people could have been cured, but nevertheless, they were not given any treatment until 1972. So Cutler, he's sort of like a really great scapegoat, for lack of a better word, just because you can see his grubby little fingerprints over all of these different medical atrocities. So it's very easy to, do the good liberal thing of like acknowledging the wrongs of the past and looking at the figure of this one unscrupulous doctor himself rather than the framework under which it was all done and the ways in which there was complicity going all the way up about what exactly was being done to these people. But more importantly, it's just like you can like basically Obama loved to do this kind of stuff, like right, just apologizing for various historical wrongs because his presidency was really positioned as like the beginning of a new type of America, sort of post-racial America, where the crimes of the past would be examined and righted. And of course, it's just like,
It's hollow. It's hollow.
yeah, I mean, like again, there's the scapegoating aspect, the fact that it's all fundamentally very hollow because this was an apology without any kind of real compensation to the victims or a deeper examination of why what happened did happen. It was like it's just once again just pinning the sins of the imperial enterprise on this one particularly evil man.
Yeah, it's just one mad scientist, not the entire like machinery of bureaucrats who were pushing for this to happen and who are happy that this happened. It's like it's just so absurd. As a proposition.
Yeah, and so again, the report it does seem to not really consider many of the questions that we brought up today. Like frankly, I'm just shocked by the lack of consideration of the bioweapon implications of this from something that's supposed to be a consideration of the wrongs of the past. In fact, let me just read from the beginning of the letter that was written by members of the commission who put this together, just because I think it's so revealing. Quote, in response to your request of November 24th, 2010, the Commission oversaw a fact-finding investigation into the specifics of the U.S. Public Health Service-led studies in Guatemala involving the intentional exposure and infection of vulnerable populations. It is the Commission's firm belief that many of the actions undertaken in Guatemala were especially egregious moral wrongs because many of the individuals involved held positions of public institutional responsibility. Moving forward a little bit, in the preface to the report, we read that, quote, in the spirit of openness and freedom of inquiry needed to restore trust and repair damage created by these revelations, the secretaries indicated that the U.S. government would launch an independent inquiry into the events. Here's one that really made my ears shoot up. Quote, the history of U.S.-supported experimentation undertaken to advance medical knowledge and protect national security is complex, with evolving ethical standards and norms. Nonetheless, the experiments in Guatemala starkly reveal that despite awareness of Department of Government officials and independent medical experts of then existing basic ethical standards to protect against using individuals as mere means to serve science and government ends, these standards were violated. Yeah, what more is there to say? They just admit that this was part of the whole national security apparatus without really considering what that means in practice.
Yeah, I mean, another thing is like a lot of the Guatemalan connections, they end up getting massive career hikes from this.
Oh,
Louis
yes.
Galich becomes a presidential contender. Carlos Salvado, who was one of the Carlos Salvado was one of the liaisons for the army, I think. He becomes a fellow. He gets a fellowship in the U.S. I don't. Dr. Mahoney was already an extremely well established researcher, and this certainly didn't hurt his like long term career. Yeah, no, Carlos Salvado was the psychiatry liaison, so he was one of the guys who was helping run the all the
Mm-hmm.
probably some of the worst experiments, and he got hired as a fellow. He becomes a well established doctor in the U.S. Um, and yeah, it's just kind of crazy that you have like all these so much like social mobility from just doing some of the most horrible things possible. They're just kind of rewarded for it, and it's just no one cares. Cutler didn't face any like real consequences for this at all, and there were lawsuits made towards certain institutions that were involved in the or okay, I'm gonna have to say this properly. There were certain lawsuits made against certain institutions relating to the Guatemala syphilis study. You can look those up. The Manuel Gudiel Garcia versus Kathleen Sebelius in 2011, and the estate of Arturo Giron Alvarez et al. Versus the John Hopkins et al. 2015. This one had 774 plaintiffs against JHU, Bristol Myers Squibb, and the Rockefeller Foundation as well. Um, and like a lot of these cases were, they're clearly outlined to generate some sort of awareness and like acknowledgement, that people were harmed. And to this day, you can go to look up JHU Guatemala syphilis, and it will on Google, and it will take you to a website of the 2015 John Hopkins media statement that you can read, and you can decide. Yeah, you can read that on your own, and decide on the disclaimer. But yeah, clearly there was every single facet of this case is like just ridden with collaboration from just all manners of national security, academia, bureaucracy, politics, compradors, just like a right wing international, just to do the most insane shit possible. And I think you can make comparisons to this to other, Cold War era projects as well that would come later on, relating to regime change or yeah, political changes too. So it's very interesting, just seeing the kind of responses this day from top established academic institutions, who were accused in certain lawsuits. So again, this is not my opinion, or I'm not implying anything about complicity in anything, nor hopefully nor the podcast, but just this is just the facts that this case happened, and there is a disclaimer you can go and read on your own.
Just to go over some numbers once again, during the course of the experiments, 83 patients are recorded to have died. But this is, I feel, a very not a great number to go by, just because, first of all, the notes taken from these experiments often weren't very reliable from what ethically impossible makes it sound like. And second of all, just this is only the death toll during the experiments themselves. We have no way of knowing how many people who had been intentionally exposed to these diseases would ultimately die of the fact that they were sick with these illnesses, which they did not have in the first place until researchers started to inject them. Do we have some idea of how many people exactly would have died, maybe from a more Guatemalan perspective?
Yeah,
I'm sure the Guatemalan government has issued reports to this on these events as well.
yeah, for sure. It's difficult to say exact death count because it also went on for like 7, 8 years, and like even if a person was infected with gonorrhea, and they got they got a severe, you know, long-term injury, then or like they got syphilis, and decades later they developed neurosyphilis. Like a lot of the psychiatric patients, like by 1953, 250, like 250 of them were like still testing positive for syphilis. So it's like pretty hard to say like how many people had long-term consequences, even if they were alive, from like the experiments, or if they've experienced recurring pain because of scarification and stuff. So it's just very difficult to say, like what would happen in the long run, like the amount of suffering that they endured, even if they somehow were able to survive. And the treatments a lot of people were given were still like arsenic and mercury, so it's like you're gonna get side effects from those too. So it's definitely very subpar treatment.
And of course, this didn't only touch the direct participants in the study. Some people, no doubt, went on to infect people because they were unaware that they were infected in the first place. In the more horrific cases, many children would have been born with congenital syphilis, which is something that happens if the mother is infected during the pregnancy, and because it's a neurological disease, this means that the children born as a result, it means that these children are often born with horrific birth defects.
Yeah, and the thing with gonorrhea is, congenital gonorrhea is terrible because it can cause blindness, and in some parts of the world, for many years, like it's one of the leading causes of congenital blindness is gonorrhea, and it's completely preventable, and you can completely just like treat it, but we don't know how many people, how many kids were blind because of this. It's hard to tell just the sheer impact of this, and no matter like no feeble acknowledgement or um, like apology can really match up to the like level of horror that was experienced here. Yeah, like we highly recommend that you guys just go and read the like disclaimers and the ethically impossible investigation yourself, and kind of discuss these questions within yourself. And I think it's good more people become aware of just how what happened and why it happened and other stuff that like this that kept happening
Right.
afterwards. So
And all right, Krebs, thank you so much for coming on for this episode and helping me to talk about this and bringing some of your own expertise to this episode. Hopefully, our listeners will find this to be a very informative, if difficult, listen. Do you have any closing remarks or anything you'd like to plug?
um no I think I'm yeah, I don't have anything to plug or any closing remarks other than yeah, just read and yeah, that's it.
Yeah, all right. Well, that's it for today, guys. Thank you for listening and take care. Goodbye.